Okay, greetings everyone. My name is Steve White, and I'd like to welcome you to my workshop presentation entitled My History, My Culture, My Genius. It's an African-centered approach to educating Black children. And I would like to welcome all of you, those who have attended my workshops in the past, those who are attending my workshop or this presentation for the very first time. Again, I welcome you all, and hopefully this is going to be time well spent. This is not a lengthy presentation, but hopefully it will be, in your opinion, a very informative presentation, and that it'll give you some information, some inspiration, some food for thought, as well as some practical suggestions that you can implement in your classroom, in your school, etc., to help Black children reach their full potential, because that's really the thrust of what we're doing. That's the real objective, if you will. We're going to talk about why it's so important to infuse African and African American, African Caribbean history and culture into the classroom. But the reason we're doing that, which we're going to talk about, is that it is all designed to help Black children reach their full potential. So again, I thank you for joining me, and we're going to move forward. So a couple of things I want to share with you, just some thoughts as we move forward. And let me just back up and give this as the foundation for this presentation. My goal here is to talk to you, to probably spend more time on why it's important to incorporate the history of African people, the culture of African people into the educational process. I believe that if you have a increased understanding of why we have to involve or include the history and the culture of people of African descent, then I trust that you will figure out exactly how to bring that to your classroom or how to bring that to your school. But I believe that one of the reasons why it hasn't been done in the past is that those who are sincerely concerned about the future of Black children really don't understand just how important it is that the history and the culture of people of African descent, that means people from the history of Africa, the history of African Americans, the history of African Caribbeans, it all has to be included in the educational process if our children are going to reach their full potential. So just look at a couple of things, or three things that I have printed on this particular page. One says that unless Black children are given the educational foundation necessary to reach their full potential, they will be stuck in a perpetual cycle of mental and physical slavery. So I want you to think about that. This is something that I wrote a year ago, and that is the fact that Black children must be given the educational foundation necessary to reach their full potential. Another writing that I came across several years ago says that if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. And the last one is the root meaning of the word educate is educe, which means to bring out or develop that which is latent or lying dormant. So now let's break this down before we move forward. If we look at the statement here that says, if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. We know that our children, they have unlimited potential that is literally lying dormant within them. Your job as educators, not as teachers, but as educators, is to understand the very definition of what your purpose is. Your purpose as an educator is to bring out or develop that which is latent or lying dormant. So if Black children have unlimited potential that is lying dormant within them, your job as an educator is to help bring that forth. If it's not brought forth, then Black children will not reach their full potential. And if they do not reach their full potential, then they are literally stuck in this perpetual cycle of mental and physical slavery. So now what I want to establish as we go forward is that in order to bring forth this unlimited potential that's lying dormant in Black children, they need to have a knowledge and appreciation of their history and their culture. You can't bring it forth without giving them a knowledge of their history and their culture, because culture is tied to true culture. It's tied to the very nature of the people that you're working with, the students that you're working with. And also, it's really a disservice to all students when they are robbed of the knowledge of the history and culture of African people and people of African descent. So the question then I pose to you is, you see these beautiful children here. This young man represents the males. This beautiful young lady represents the females. Will you allow these children to die? Because I'm going to say to you, as I tried to establish on the previous slide, that unless we give these children a full-rounded educational process that will bring forth their unlimited potential, once again, that is lying dormant, unless we give them the type of education that will bring forth their full potential, they are literally dying. It's a mental death, it's a spiritual death, and then ultimately it's a physical death. So will you allow these children to die? That's the question that I posed to you. And so I really want you to understand the importance of African history and culture, the importance of African American, and African Caribbean history and culture. And that's what we're going to talk about, the importance of it. And then we're going to talk about some of the practical things you can do in your classroom, in your school, to infuse the history and culture of African people into all aspects of the curriculum. So before we do that, I'm just going to take just a few minutes, or not even a few minutes, but I just want to tell you just a little bit about myself, just to establish some credibility for the topic that we're speaking on today. I am Steve White. As I said, I've been doing educational workshops since 1990, working as a consultant, and as I said, actually being a presenter as well, working with schools, social service agencies, colleges and universities, community organizations, churches, prisons. I've been doing that work since 1990. So that's about 31 years now as I make this presentation to you. In 2004, I also started a book publishing company. That company is still going strong as well. I have a mentoring program that I developed in 1993 that is a nationally recognized mentoring program. I've actually been a mentor for 35 years, but this particular program, entitled From Black Boy to Black Man, What Does It Take, is a program that I started in 1993. I also have a prison reentry program, and that gives me the opportunity to go into prisons and actually work with young men who are incarcerated and help to prepare them for successful reentry back into society, if you will. And that's a program that I'm always excited about, and it's something that I'm very passionate about, being able to work with the young men that are incarcerated, because some of our most talented Black men are behind prison walls. And as a people, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for us to really move forward without these men coming back and giving what they have to give, sharing what they have to share. But that's a whole nother discussion, because we can go in depth about the whole prison system, the prison industrial complex, and what it does to Black people, male and female. In 2015, I was named the National Mentor of the Year by 100 Black Men of America. In 2018, I was named one of South Florida's top Black educators by Legacy magazine. That same year, 2018, I was honored, one of 5 people across the country that was honored by the Tom Joyner Foundation for our work in our communities. I've also received the Key to the City from Riviera Beach, Florida. That's the city I was born and raised. That's the city in which I live now. And I mention that because it's always an honor to be recognized by the city in which where you grew up. Oftentimes we have to go away and we're recognized someplace else. So to have my hometown recognize me means a lot to me. I've worked with so many different organizations over the years, fraternities, sororities, schools, churches, colleges, universities, as I mentioned. And then also my publishing company, we've received 9 silver medals from the Florida Authors and Publishers Association as well. So I just wanted to just tell you a little bit about myself from a professional point of view. Now, let's get into this. So again, like I said, my goal in this presentation is to make sure that you understand why it is critically important that the history and culture of African people, people of African descent, that it is included in an effective manner in the classrooms, because if not, then we're not going to move our children forward. So I want to talk a little bit about the dehumanizing of African people in America, or as I would subtitle it, how to justify the destruction of a people. And you will see as we talk about this, why, again, the importance of African and African-American history and culture. So the dehumanizing of African people started really with slavery in America. I'm saying the dehumanizing of African people when we were brought here by force, those of us who were brought here by force and forced into slavery, this American institution called slavery. So what did this institution do to lay the foundation for the dehumanizing of our people and the elimination of our history and our culture? And again, why it's so important that we put it back into the classroom. So one of the first things it did was it actually taught African people and white people for that matter, that Africans did not have a significant history and culture. They did not say, so you can't say, and this is where things get really tricky. Oftentimes people say, well, they denied the knowledge of our history and culture. No, what they really said was you don't have a significant history and culture that is even worth remembering. And so we weren't allowed to learn of our history and culture once we became an enslaved people. And white people were robbed of that knowledge as well. And although it made them feel superior, they really didn't understand that they were standing on slippery ground and they did not know the history and culture of these people that they were now enslaving and dehumanizing. So they taught African people, but they also taught white people, like I said, that Africans did not have a significant history and culture. This institution called slavery, this American institution called slavery, also forbid enslaved people from learning to read and write the English language because they would find out the truth and they would expose the lies. Now, I want to clear up something else. Oftentimes we hear and we're taught that the slaves were forbidden to read and write, and they did not know how to read and write. Being brought from Africa to America, they did not know how to read and write the English language. But understand that the Africans on the African continent had a history, had a culture, had a written language, okay, that they spoke their native tongue. When they came here and they were thrust into this American society called slavery, they weren't allowed to learn how to read and write in a new language called English. And because they did not bring their own scripts with them, their own texts with them, their own books with them, if you will, and they weren't allowed to practice their own culture, they could not remember their history, at least not verbally. And of course, once families were torn apart, that history and that culture was lost, which was the whole point of tearing the families apart. But African people did not come here ignorant. They came here simply not knowing, ignorant in the sense of not being able to read and write. They simply came here and they were thrust into a new culture that was foreign to them, a language that was foreign to them, a culture that was foreign to them, food that was foreign to them. And they had to learn to adapt to a culture that was not their own, a culture that was not in line with the very nature of the people that were being enslaved. And so they suffered trying to, or being forced to live under a culture that was foreign to them. And they suffered when they were not able to pass on their cultural practices, their history, their norms, if you will. And so I want you to understand that this process of eliminating African-American and African history and culture started then, and those who started it understood how effective it was when you rob the people of their history and culture. So it is not an accident that the history and culture of African people is still not included in the classroom. This is why those of you who are listening to this, if you're really committed to the uplifting of Black people and helping Black children reach their full potential, you've got to include the history and culture of people of African descent into the classroom. So we're looking at what was done through this American institution called slavery. The media, even back then, was a cooperating entity. Their job was to portray African people, again, as subhuman, because as long as African people, people of African descent, those who were enslaved, were portrayed as subhuman, then it was a way that white people could then justify their treatment of the people that they were enslaving. Because after all, if they were subhuman, who would care, who would sympathize or empathize with the people who were less than them? So that was the goal, to dehumanize African people, make them believe they were less than, and therefore justify their condition of life and their treatment. So to murder, rape, enslave people that you don't consider to be your equal, it's much easier to justify that. White America then was relieved of their guilt and their obligations to right their wrongs, which is the same situation that we are experiencing now in 2021. They have been, their goal is to relieve themselves of their guilt by saying that what happened back then, we had nothing to do with it, by saying that Black people must pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, ignoring all of the racism and oppression and discrimination that Black people have been subjected to, being subjected to an educational system that intentionally miseducates them. But their argument is, we're not guilty. And the same as it was made 200 years ago, 300 years ago, the same argument was made then. Because if you have dehumanized the people, you have made them subconsciously and consciously in the minds of many people, as well as in their own minds, oftentimes, and we're going to talk about that. You have made them to feel like they were less than, then you can justify the treatment, and you're not going to get a sympathetic ear or a sympathetic feeling from people who believe that these people are literally getting what they deserve, and their condition is what they deserve. Okay, let's continue with this. Here's what continued to happen. And again, I want you to pay attention to this because it lays the foundation for what's happening in 2021, and it lays the foundation for what you must be doing as educators to change this situation. Negative racist stereotypes were created about Black people that many white and Black people accepted as true. This is very important. These racist stereotypes by many Black people and many white people were accepted as true. And so these stereotypes led many white people to believe that they were indeed superior, and many Black people to believe that they were inferior. Black on Black murders and the murder of Black people by the police, the reason why they're tolerated even today is because the victims of these murders, they aren't valued in this society. Black people murder other Black people, and we'll go into this, because of their own self-hatred, because of their own low self-esteem, and all of that process of robbing Black people of their self-esteem and bringing about the kind of Black on Black hatred and a hatred for self that will allow us to murder each other. It goes all the way back to this American institution called slavery. The murder of Black people by the police, even in 2021, we don't like to talk about it or admit it, but one of the reasons why it can take place, and one of the reasons why it continues to take place, is because the people that are being murdered are really not valued by this society. You don't see Jewish people. Jewish people talk about the anti-Semitism that they experience, and their anti-Semitism, I'm not taking away from that or questioning the reality or the validity of it, but you don't see Jewish people being shot down in the street by the police, because Jewish people have Jewish power, Jewish people are valued in this society, and the murder of Jewish people by the police would not be tolerated. So you're not going to see a Jewish person being murdered in the streets, a knee on their neck for the whole world to see. You're not going to see that happen because the police themselves know that the power and the value of the Jewish people, that they could not get away with that. But because Black people have been rendered powerless in many ways, and because they are not valued, then you can get away with that. So once again, you've got to understand that when Black people learn about their history and their culture, that helps to change this situation, and it helps to empower Black people. This is a very, very serious topic. The educational system can abdicate its responsibility by relying on the false assumption that Blacks are intellectually inferior. See, once the stereotype was created that Black people were intellectually inferior, don't fool yourself and think that that stereotype has been done away with. It has not. You will have white society, meaning the media, the educational system, the government, etc. You will have them highlight a Black person here and a Black person there and say, well, look at this Black person. They're doing so well. They're such a high achiever. They're the valedictorian, or they're a scientist, or they're this or they're that. When they highlight just individuals here and there, you have to understand there's a subconscious message that's being sent to Black people, and very importantly, also to white people. And what that subconscious message is that these unique individuals, if you will, that's being highlighted are just that. They're unique. They're not like most Black people. And any Black person that has achieved a certain level of quote unquote success in America, who speaks the language well, and you all, Black people, know exactly what I'm talking about. If you carry yourself in a certain way that is approving or meets the approval of certain white people, some of us have actually heard the term, you're not like most Black people. So when they highlight just a pocket or a small number of Blacks in certain areas, they're not doing that to dispel this myth that Black people are intellectually inferior. They're actually doing that in many ways to reinforce the myth that Black people are intellectually inferior by saying, here are some exceptions. And normally those exceptions, oftentimes they have been trained by white people. They have gone to so-called white universities, so they can say, well, you know, he went to Ivy League school, so of course, you know, we trained him. We found one that had a little intellect, and we plucked him up and brought him into our institutions and trained him or her, and look at what we produce. But they're not like most Black people. So you have to understand, by creating that racist stereotype and perpetuating that myth, the educational system has really been able to abdicate its responsibility, because people are not up in arms about the way Black children are performing in the school system, because subconsciously and consciously, for that matter, there is an underlying myth that exists in the minds of many people that Black children are literally doing the best they can. The reason they are coming up in the rear when it comes to academics is that it is just a reflection of their true intellect. And so it has taken the educational system off the hook. Otherwise, why aren't people up in arms about the fact that African-American history and culture is not taught, African Caribbean history and culture is not taught, that Black children are not performing up to their potential, and nobody really seems to be alarmed by it. There does not seem to be an emergency in the mindset of the people, even the parents of the very children. The other thing that happens is that the media then can continue with their racist stereotypical portrayal of Blacks, because they can simply claim that we are reflecting Black culture and Black reality. So if they make movies and TV shows and it's full of buffoonery, full of violence, full of gang banging, dehumanizing our Black women and turning them into just sexual beings and all of this, then they can say, well, that's the culture of Black people. Go look at them. Go look at what they have created in their communities. That's who they are. And so again, but they can rely on these racist stereotypes that permeate the society. So what does all that mean? It means that the worst thing about these negative stereotypes is that white people start to believe them. But what is even worse is that when the people who are stereotyped start to believe them and to act accordingly. See, the reason why you continue to stereotype Black people and put those images out there is that after a while, Black people start to believe that that's who they are as well. So if we're shown that only thing that we can do is play sports and make music, then eventually we will gravitate only to those areas. If we are told that we're not smart, eventually we will start to believe that. Now, nobody wants to admit that, but that's a true fact. When you stereotype of people for so long, the people who are stereotyped oftentimes will start to believe it themselves. Now, you can stereotype people in a positive way and they can start to believe that. Or you can stereotype people in a negative way and they will start to believe that. So this is again why the history and culture of people of African descent must be put into the classroom, because it will counteract these negative stereotypes about who Black people, who Black children really are. Moving right along, self-esteem. This is what I'm saying. When you dehumanize a people, when you rob them of the knowledge of their history and their culture, and so they then can start to believe that they have no history and culture that they should be proud of. And so it hits right at the essence of who we are, the essence of who Black children are. And so Black children then grow up oftentimes with low self-esteem. And then those Black children, of course, become Black adults with low self-esteem. And what does self-esteem mean? It simply means one's opinion of their own value or self-worth. Well, if you have been dehumanized generation after generation after generation, if your people have been dehumanized and you have not received the proper education and the proper information to counteract the lies and the myths and the stereotypes, then you will start to question your own value and your own self-worth. And so Black children then will start to suffer from self-esteem issues, and it will affect their lives, including their performance in the classroom, because they are not receiving the reinforcement that affirms their intellect and their intellectual ability. So not having their history and culture affirmed impacts their self-esteem. So if you are the Black child, subconsciously, again, you may ask the question, am I smart? Am I smart, when the emphasis is too often on sports and music as the major accomplishments of Black people? And I love sports and I love music, so I'm not being critical of sports and music, but what I'm criticizing is the lack of balance and the lack of truth. So am I smart? Because I don't see my intellect being affirmed, but I certainly see my athletic ability and my musical talent being affirmed and encouraged. And again, I wish I had time to really go into why that is, because there's a reason why this white society, based on white supremacy, they're not threatened by Black people achieving well in sports, on the field, on the football field, on the basketball court, etc. And why they're not threatened by Black people achieving as music performers. That helps to actually reinforce some of the stereotypes that they have created. But anyway, Black children then ask the question, am I beautiful? Am I beautiful when beauty is affirmed as white or those who look closer to white? Let's be honest. So what's wrong with my features? These are the subconscious questions that children ask, that they may not verbalize to you, but because their history and culture has not been affirmed, it may not have been affirmed in the home, it's not affirmed in the media, it's not affirmed in the school system. So they start to question, what's wrong with my features? What's wrong with my dark skin, my nappy hair, my broad nose, my thick lips? You've got to understand that, okay? There's a reason why Black people, Black women, and some Black men are even bleaching their skin to appear lighter. See, this thing goes very, very deep. And I know some of you may not even want me to tread on that, but it's the reality. And so I'm trying to, again, just lay the foundation for why Black children need to know their history and culture. Because history and culture tells you who you are and what you are capable of. Let me say that again. History and culture tells you who you are and what you are capable of. And what has happened is the crime of omission is what you left out that matters. So when you eliminate the history and culture of children of African descent, you automatically elevate the culture and history of those whose history and culture is taught and affirmed. So you don't, if you're focusing on European history and culture in this educational system, if you're focusing on European history and culture and there is no focus on the history and culture of children of African descent, you don't have to say to them, your history and culture does not matter. You don't have a significant history and culture. The fact that it has been omitted from the educational process. Once again, I love to keep talking about these subconscious messages because that's how we receive so many of our messages subconsciously. The subconscious message is your history and culture does not matter because we're not even taking time to address it, or at least especially in an effective way. And what you're saying to those of European descent, those students of European descent whose history and culture is being taught and oftentimes is being taught falsely, but that's a topic for another day as well. But that then says to them that their culture and their history is important. So if the history and culture of people of African descent is not taught, then it's easy for children, it's easy for the educators, it's easy for the parents to conclude that they really have no culture and history that is worthy of being taught, worthy of being respected, of valued and honored. You understand? So it's this crime of omission. Just leave it out. And so by leaving it out, you have automatically minimized it or actually caused it to literally not even exist in the minds of many people. This is why sometimes when you talk to adults or talk to children and you tell them about the great things that African people have done, they find it sometimes impossible to believe because no one has ever taught them that Black people were doing these great things, that Black people created and gave to the world civilization and all that comes with it. So they've never been taught that. So it sounds strange to them. But this is what happened when you omit the history and the culture of people of African descent. So what can you do? Here's what we have to talk about, right? Because again, like I said, my goal was to lay a foundation. I hope that you understand the value of infusing the history and culture of African people into the curriculum, into the classroom on every level. And that's what we're going to talk about now. But first and foremost, it says, what can you do? It asks the question, what can you do? One is you can make a commitment. Those of you who are listening, you must make a personal commitment to learn about the history and culture of African people, and then bring that knowledge into your classroom or whatever capacity you influence children. Whether you are an administrator, whether you are a parent that's watching this presentation, or of course, if you are a teacher / educator, then make a personal commitment. Don't rely on the school system. Don't rely on anything else other than yourself, first and foremost, to make a commitment to learn about the history and culture of African people. And then you bring that knowledge into your classroom or whatever capacity you influence children. Secondly, what I'd like to see you do is to affirm children of African descent. As you learn about the history and culture of African people, you should then develop a sincere appreciation for who they are, their capabilities, their history, and their culture. And you then, as the teacher, can express that appreciation in how you approach teaching in your particular classroom or educating in your classroom. So what can you do? Make that commitment, first of all, to learn about the history and culture of African people. Bring that knowledge into your classroom. Affirm children of African descent. Develop a sincere appreciation for who they are and express that appreciation in your classroom. What else can you do? So just some practical things that some of you may be doing, but I want to remind you and maybe stimulate you to do a little more or motivate you to do a little more. Create a visual experience in your classroom. Black children, and really most children, but Black children in particular, are very visual. So there should be posters and other art on the walls and inside your classroom that emphasizes African, African American, and African Caribbean history and culture. The art should be used to stimulate conversation and to stimulate teachable sessions in the classroom. It should not just be for decoration. So don't just put a picture of Martin Luther King on the wall. Please, you've got to do a whole lot more than that. Don't put a picture of Harriet Tubman or Barack Obama on the wall and walk away thinking that you've made your contribution. No. If you're going to put these images on the wall, and you should, and let's broaden the images that you put on the wall, the art that you put on the wall, etc., beyond just the same always go-to faces. But then let it be used to stimulate conversation, stimulate teachable sessions in the classroom. It's not just for decoration. That's very important. But again, as you have, going back to the previous slide, if you have delved into learning as much as you can about the history and culture of African people and people of African descent, then you're going to know a lot more about other people and other images, art, etc., that you can put on your walls and infuse into your educational process. Okay, what else you should do? Place literature and music, books, magazines, music, etc. Place it in the classrooms for students to read and hear. Find African, African American, and African Caribbean music, dance, art, and speakers on the internet, such as on YouTube, that you can introduce into your classroom with your students. You can actually do travel excursions from the classroom using YouTube. There are people who travel the whole world and they put these videos right there on YouTube. So you can introduce the children, all of your students, to Africa and the Caribbean and Australia, where you find the Aborigines, and other, the South Pacific, where you find Aborigines, people who are of African descent. All of these things you can find and do, even right there on YouTube. So do travel excursions from the classroom using YouTube and other apps and social media. You can invite guest speakers to your classroom to introduce African, Caribbean, and African American culture to your students. I mean, over the years, I've spoken to many classrooms over the years during Black History Month. Of course, that's unfortunate that seems to be the time. But there are a lot of things that you can do if you have if you have made a commitment to learning as much as you can about African American history and culture and understanding its importance. And now you are committed to infusing it into your classroom. And if you are an administrator, committed to bringing it to your school or to your school district, if you will, then you'll learn of some of the things and you will embrace some of these things that you can do to introduce the history and the culture of African people. What else can you do? Just to piggyback on what I said earlier, do your research, find out about the accomplishments of African, Caribbean, and African American contributions in every subject area, and introduce African culture, because it's not limited to history only. So if you're teaching math, you can include African American, African Caribbean, and African history and culture into your math lessons, into your science lessons, into your reading lessons, into your history lessons, into your PE lessons. If you're talking about construction, engineering, architecture, manufacturing, medicine, technology, whatever you're talking about, Black people have played an integral role in every one of those disciplines or subjects. And so you, as you're researching, you will learn. If you're going to talk about math, you can find the great African mathematicians. Matter of fact, we know that Africans created mathematics. So we know that Africans created science. The Africans were the first to read, and therefore Africans have the most extensive history as well. That we are the first engineers and architects. So all of these things, as you do your research, and then there are great engineers and architects, people in medicine and technology right up to the 21st century, bring their accomplishments and their contributions into your classroom. So you give examples of their accomplishments. Be creative. There are games out there. There are board games. There are books. There are music, as we talked about. There are other activities that highlight the history and culture of African, African American, and African Caribbean people. Bring it into your classroom. And we can't use the excuse that we don't have time to do this. We've just got to focus on the test, which has always become the fallback excuse, if you will. But I have been in classrooms of creative teachers who find ways to take the liberties that they have to be creative in their classroom, and you can do the same. The other thing you can do is teach your students. Let your students know, and I'm talking Black students, white students, Latino students, it doesn't matter. Let them know about the foods, about the clothing, about the music, about the language, and other cultural practices from Africa, from the Caribbean, and from African Americans that has been incorporated into the American society. So you have people who wear clothing and don't know that the origin of their clothing has an African origin. You have people who listen to music and music that they love and don't realize it has an African foundation, that there's words that have been incorporated into the language that they use that don't realize it has an African origin. There are foods that they eat. White people, Black people, Latino people, it doesn't matter. And they don't understand that those foods were introduced and they have their origin in Africa. So all of these things give not just children of African descent, but all children a greater appreciation for the history and culture of African people. And of course, you're doing the same thing in all of the disciplines that we talked about at the top of the page: history, science, architect, manufacturing, medicine, technology, etc. So the last thing that I say to you is that my goal was to lay a foundation for why it's so vitally important that all children, but in particular that children of African descent, know about their history and their culture. They're not going to reach their full potential, not the masses. We will just spend our time being content to have an exception here or there. But if you want to move the masses of African children forward, of children of African descent, Black children forward, then they need to know their history and culture. There's a reason why the history and culture of Europe is taught, because it strengthens children of European descent. Simple as that. So obviously, if you teach the history and culture of Africa, it strengthens children of African descent. So your commitment at the end of the day is, again, what it comes down to. It's your commitment that matters. And the question that I always pose when I talk to teachers, parents, whomever it is that I'm working with, if there's a challenge in front of us, the question is, are you willing? Are you willing to embrace the challenge? Are you willing to move beyond conversation, just talking about the problem, just talking about the solutions? Are you willing to really do the work, to incorporate the solutions into your classroom, into your school, into your school district? Are you willing? Because if you're not committed and you're not willing, then this is just conversation that goes for naught. So I hope and I pray that you are, because the future of Black children is at stake. And if the future of Black children is at stake, then it means the future of Black people is at stake. So let's get busy and do what we are supposed to do. Thank you.